She died in 60 AD. And then, for nearly 1500 years, she simply ceased to exist. Not defeated in memory. Not remembered as a cautionary tale. Not preserved as a villain in Roman histories that children were made to read. Just gone. Completely. As if the woman who had burned 3 cities, destroyed a Roman legion, and come closer than anyone to ending Rome's occupation of Britain had never existed at all. No grave. No monument. No oral tradition that survived. The Iceni, whose queen she had been, were absorbed into the Roman province. Their language faded. Their stories disappeared. And the 2 Roman historians who had written about her, Tacitus and Cassius Dio, sat in monastery libraries across Europe, unread, slowly deteriorating on shelves that nobody visited for reasons that had nothing to do with Boudica and everything to do with the collapse of the civilization that had produced them. For 15 centuries, the most dangerous woman Rome ever faced in Britain was nobody. What happened next is one of the strangest stories in the history of historical memory. A story about how a name survives, how a legend gets rebuilt from 2 damaged manuscripts, and how a Victorian queen with a very specific political agenda turned a forgotten Iron Age warrior into one of the most recognizable figures in British history. This is the last episode, and it's about why any of this matters. If you've made it to the final episode of this series, thank you. Genuinely. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now before we finish, because this episode is the one that ties everything together. Like the video if this series has been worth your time. Let's close it out. Here is something that should feel impossible, given everything you've seen in this series. Bede, the greatest historian of early medieval Britain, the man whose ecclesiastical history of the English people is one of the most important documents of the period, does not mention Boudica once. Not a line. Not a reference. Nothing. Geoffrey of Monmouth, whose History of the Kings of Britain in the 12th century invented or preserved some version of almost every significant figure from British prehistory, Arthur, Lear, Cymbeline, somehow managed to write an entire history of Britain without finding room for the woman who nearly ended Roman rule of the island. The Mabinogion. The Historia Brittonum. Every major text of early medieval Britain that we have. She appears in none of them. This is not an accident. It is the natural result of what happened to the culture that might have remembered her. The Iceni were absorbed. Their language was absorbed. The oral tradition that would have carried her story, the tradition that kept Celtic history alive without writing it down, was disrupted, diluted, eventually replaced by the Christian Latin culture of medieval Britain, which drew its history from Rome. And Rome, for understandable reasons, was not particularly interested in celebrating the woman who had killed 70,000 of its citizens and burned 3 of its cities. So she disappeared. For 1500 years. In 1360, nearly 13 centuries after Boudica's death, a manuscript of Tacitus's Annals was rediscovered in a monastery. Think about what that means. Every single thing we know about Boudica from the ancient world, her physical description, her speeches, the details of the revolt, the flogging, the daughters, the battle, all of it was sitting in a document that had been effectively inaccessible for over a millennium. Not destroyed. Just lost in the way that things get lost before the printing press. One copy in a monastery library that nobody with the right combination of interest, literacy, and access ever happened to open. When Polydore Virgil, an Italian humanist scholar working in England, encountered these manuscripts in 1534, he became the first person in roughly 1,000 years to write about Boudica in English. He called her Boadicea. He actually thought she and the Cassius Dio version, Bunduica, were 2 separate women because the manuscripts gave such different spellings of the name. He was wrong. But he was the reason she came back. Raphael Holinshed included her story in his Chronicles in 1577, drawing directly on Tacitus and Dio. And that book, the Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland, ended up on the desk of a playwright named William Shakespeare, who used it as his primary source for his historical plays. Shakespeare didn't write about Boudica. But his younger contemporaries Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher did. Their play Boudica premiered around 1610. The first time Boudica appeared on a London stage. In a city she had burned 1500 years earlier. History has a very particular sense of irony. Before we go further, there is something worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how fragile historical memory actually is. Her name. Tacitus spelled it Boudica in his manuscripts. Clearly. Consistently. But at some point in the Middle Ages, when a monk was copying one of those manuscripts by hand in poor light with cold fingers and no particular reason to be careful about the name of a woman who hadn't been mentioned in any text he'd ever read, a letter changed. Then another. By the time the Renaissance scholars were reading their recovered manuscripts, the name had drifted. And the version that caught on, The one that Holinshed used, that playwrights used, that historians used for the next 4 centuries, was Boadicea. Not her name. A medieval copying error that became so embedded in the cultural record that it wasn't fully corrected until the 20th century, when scholars went back to the best surviving manuscripts of Tacitus and established that the original spelling was almost certainly Boudica, derived from the Proto-Celtic word Buda, meaning victory. Her name meant victory. She was known by the wrong name for 400 years. Even in memory, history found ways to make things difficult for her. We are almost at the end of a story that started nearly 2,000 years ago. If this series has given you something, a different way of thinking about this history, about what gets remembered and why, hit that like button. It matters more than you know for a channel like this. Stay with me for the last section. It's the best one. The Victorian era did something extraordinary with Boudica's story. It took a woman who had burned 3 cities, killed 70,000 people, and fought to the end against Roman occupation, and turned her into a symbol of the British Empire. Read that again. The woman who fought against imperial occupation became, in the 19th century, a symbol of imperial power. The mechanics of this transformation are worth understanding, because they tell you something important about how history gets used by the people who control it. Queen Victoria's name, Victoria, shares its root with Boudica's. Both derive from the concept of victory. Victoria's poet laureate, Alfred Lord Tennyson, wrote a poem called Boadicea. Ships were named after her. And Prince Albert himself commissioned the bronze statue that stands outside the Houses of Parliament today. Boudica in her war chariot, her daughters beside her, spear raised, looking toward the city she had burned. The Victorians were not being ironic. They genuinely saw Boudica as a precursor to Victoria, 2 warrior queens, both defending Britain against foreign threat. The fact that Boudica had been the foreign threat, from Rome's perspective, was quietly set aside. The fact that the Empire Boudica was resisting bore certain structural similarities to the Empire Victoria was building was not a comparison the Victorians were interested in making. But the statue got built. And it is extraordinary. It stands at the northern end of Westminster Bridge, directly across from the Houses of Parliament. On the base, a line from William Cowper's 1782 poem, "Regent Caesar never knew thy posterity shall sway. Boudica's descendants ruling the world." That was what the Victorians saw when they looked at her. What we see when we look at her might be something more complicated and more interesting. The suffragettes found her in 1908. In that year, a Boadicea banner was carried in National Union of Women's Suffrage Society's marches. Women who were fighting for the right to vote, carrying the image of a woman who had fought for the right to exist on her own terms 2,000 years earlier. The connection was obvious to them. The message was obvious. This is not a new fight. Women have been here before. Women have done more than this before. That is a very different Boudica than the one the Victorians had built. Not a symbol of empire. A symbol of resistance. Not a queen whose legacy validates power. A woman whose legacy challenges it. Both versions are built from the same 2 Roman sources, Tacitus and Cassius Dio. Both are true in the sense that both capture something real about what she was. And the tension between them is not a problem to be resolved. It is the most honest thing about her legacy. She was a queen who used the political system available to her until that system failed her completely. She was a military commander who built the largest fighting force in British history from a standing start. She was a mother whose daughters were the reason she went to war and the people she carried with her to the last battle. She was a tactician who won every engagement until she lost the one that mattered. She was a woman who chose the terms of her own death rather than surrender them to the people who had already taken everything else. She was all of these things simultaneously. And the reason she keeps getting rediscovered, in the Renaissance, in the Victorian era, by the suffragettes, in every generation that finds its way back to those 2 damaged Roman manuscripts, is that each generation finds something different in her that they needed to find. That is what it means to be a historical figure who actually matters. The statue on Westminster Bridge was commissioned by Prince Albert, designed by Thomas Thornycroft, and finally installed in 1902, 40 years after Thornycroft began working on it. It shows Boudica in her war chariot, arms raised, daughters beside her, looking toward the city she burned. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary thing to put outside a parliament building. The city she burned put her there. The civilization that defeated her built the monument. The empire whose structural logic she was fighting, whether the Victorians wanted to admit that or not, celebrated her on its most symbolic street. There is something in that which defies easy summary. Something about how history works, about how meaning accumulates around certain lives and certain choices, about how the things that seem most definitively ended sometimes turn out to be the most permanent. Boudica died in 60 AD. Her army was destroyed. Her daughters disappeared from the record. Her people were absorbed into the empire that had tried to break her. Rome is gone. The empire is gone. The province of Britannia is gone. The statue is still there. Her name, the correct one, the one that means victory, the one that got lost for centuries in a copying error and had to be recovered from a damaged manuscript, is still spoken. In the city she burned. Outside the parliament of the country that grew up on the land she fought for. By people who mostly don't know the full story of what she did to get there. Now you do.